Hello students, this is Professor McDermott. Well, I mentioned on the last slide of the Roman Empire lecture that for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire in Western Europe, there was still a Roman Empire in the East, with an emperor whose headquarters was at the city of Constantinople. And we usually call this empire the Byzantine Empire because of the original name of the town where Constantinople was built by the Emperor Constantine. So we're going to talk about that civilization today, but also about how the Byzantine Empire gradually weakened, making way for the rise of a new world superpower, Islam, the Islamic civilization. Um, in the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire was really riding high under its emperor Justinian, who ruled from the year 527 AD to 565 AD, supported by his very strong-willed wife, the Empress Theodora, who was a former stage actress and prostitute. Justinian set out to reconquer the Western Roman Empire and to rule it. And we'll come back to this slide, but I just want to show you on the map that Justinian was partly successful. You see that he was able to retake all of Italy and parts of North Africa and what's now Spain. And so you could say in that sense Justinian's reign was a great success. Justinian was also very interested in law. Specifically, he commissioned a series of 4 law books to be compiled called the Corpus Juris Civilis in Latin. In English, we call it the Body of Civil Law. Basically, Justinian's goal was to gather up and to collect and to catalog all of the laws that had ever been passed in the old Roman Republic, the Roman Empire, and the Byzantine Empire. The first volume of the Corpus Juris Civilis is called the Institutes. This is just a law textbook of the sort that some of you may use if you go on to law school. The second book, however, was perhaps the most influential of the 4 books of the Corpus Juris Civilis. It was called the Digest. Basically, the digest consisted of legal opinions given by important Roman judges and lawyers. So this was case law that had been handed down as precedent by Roman judges. The third volume was called the Code. These were statute laws, that is, laws which had been passed by the people of Rome during the Republic or by the emperors of Rome during the later period of the Roman Empire. Volume 4 was known as the Novels, and these were all of the laws which had been passed by the Emperor Justinian himself. So this was really a magnificent achievement. However, fairly quickly, all of the existing copies of the Corpus Juris Civilis in Western Europe were lost. And it was the rediscovery of parts of this collection, especially the Digest, in later centuries that would really influence the development of Western European law and politics, as we will see later in the course. Well, Justinian's achievements did not long survive his death, unfortunately. Only 3 years after Justinian died, starting in 568 AD, another barbarian group called the Lombards succeeded in capturing most of Italy and ruling it until 774 AD. But the Byzantine Empire continued. It was a very unique sort of civilization. It could be a very cruel place, especially if you were a member of the imperial family. In Byzantium, there was a law that no blind person could serve as emperor. And so it was quite common for members of the imperial family to be blinded by their rivals who were trying to seize the throne from them. But it was also technologically sophisticated, culturally advanced, very refined society in a number of ways, especially in terms of its architecture and its visual arts. You see on the left there an example of Byzantine art. Most Byzantine art came in the form of what are called icons, images of Christ or the Blessed Virgin Mary or the saints. If you ever have the chance to go into an Eastern Orthodox church, which is this type of Christianity is descended from Byzantine Christianity, the first thing you'll notice is that basically every square inch of the walls and the ceiling are usually covered with these beautiful icons. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And it was indeed a very religious society, in spite of the cruelty. In fact, the Empress Theodora herself, her favorite hobby was having theological debates with the bishops of the church. Although with her background, you have to wonder what they thought about having those conversations. But she was a very intelligent lady, and she certainly held her own in those conversations. In terms of religion, at first, the Christians in the Byzantine Empire were still part of the Roman Catholic Church. That is, they were in communion with the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, the head of the Roman Catholic Church. But as time went on, being in a different nation from Rome and being rather separate from Western Europe culturally, these Eastern Christians began to develop their own unique practices and beliefs, such as the icons. Now, most of these Eastern Christians believed that God, in a sense, was really present in these sacred images, not physically, but in some way, God imparted a certain spiritual power through these icons. But there were other members of the Eastern Christian Church who disagreed with that, and they pointed to one of the commandments which said, you shall not make any graven image of any god, and they believed that to make images, religious images, was idolatry, and that if people showed honor to these icons, they were in fact worshiping idols instead of the true God. And this belief gave rise to the movement called iconoclasm, where certain people would go around churches in the Eastern Empire and smash or destroy statues and paintings of sacred subjects. And so this was a huge controversy in the Byzantine Empire for many years, but finally the bishops of the church got together in a council and decided that yes, it was acceptable to show special honor to icons because of what they represented. And as I said, still to this day, members of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which did split off from the Roman Catholic Church in the year 1053 AD, still show great reverence to these icons. What were some of the other factors leading to the split between Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholic Christianity? One was the role of the Pope. The Eastern Christians felt that the Pope had just become too powerful in the Western Church. Another issue was that the Eastern Christians tended to be a lot more interested in developing their own personal holiness, that is, their individual relationship with God, often through such practices as extreme fasting and bodily penance, in a sense punishing their bodies and disciplining their bodies in order to rise to a higher spiritual plane. Whereas the Catholic Church, centered in Rome, tended to focus more, not exclusively, but focused more on rules and regulations as to how Christians should treat each other and how they should live together in community rather than personal holiness for all Christians. And so, in a sense, that division, while that's not universally true, that division in a general sense does continue to this day between the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Catholic Church. In terms of the life of the mind, the Byzantines did do a good job, because they did speak Greek, of preserving the old scientific and philosophical books from ancient Greece, but they really were not very creative in terms of developing new ideas or new medical technologies or so forth based on those ancient teachings, but they did help to preserve them for the future. But the Byzantines frequently were at war with their arch enemies, the Persian Empire, and over the centuries, Byzantium and Persia really wore each other out with this constant fighting. Both empires became much weaker as a result, and in a way that provided an opening for the great new civilization of Islam to emerge. And it started in the city of Mecca in what is today Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. Now, Mecca had always been, or for centuries, had been considered a holy city because there was a sacred stone in the middle of the city called the Kaaba. It was actually, or it is actually, a meteor that at some point in the distant unknown past fell from space, hit Mecca, and then was set up as a sort of religious shrine in Mecca. So it had always been a place with a lot of religious ferment and devotion to many gods, actually. But sometime around the year 570 AD, a man was born in Mecca whose name was Muhammad, who became the prophet of Islam. Now, Muhammad was a businessman by trade. He was not actually a priest or a religious leader at first. He was involved in trade and commerce. But he began to receive visions when he was in his early middle age from the archangel Gabriel, who revealed to him the teachings of the new religion that would become Islam. And so Muhammad began to gather followers around himself there in Mecca, and his new religion became very controversial in Mecca, so much so that he was actually driven out of that city in the year 622, and he and his followers had to relocate to another city called Medina for a while. Muslims call this journey the Hijra, and actually the Muslim calendar begins with this year of the Hijra, which for Westerners is 622 AD. Muhammad also recited to his followers the teachings that he had learned in his visions, and his disciples wrote these teachings down in a book which is the sacred scripture of the Muslim religion, the Holy Quran. And that word Quran means recitation, because Muhammad spoke all the words in the Quran out loud. They were written down by others. Well, the Islamic religion grew. Muhammad was able to go back to Mecca and establish that as his power base. And from there, Islam continued to expand in a remarkable way. When Muhammad died in 632 AD, authority, the chief authority over Islam, passed to Muhammad's father-in-law, whose name was Abu Bakr. And the title that was taken by Abu Bakr, a member of Muhammad's family, was the title of Caliph. Now, for many years, there was a Caliph in the Islamic world. That title had expired, though, until very recently, when a man named al-Baghdadi, the leader of a group known as ISIS, proclaimed that he is the new caliph over the entire Islamic religion. And as I record this lecture in 2021, ISIS has suffered a lot of defeats and reversals, but it still does exist and is trying to reestablish the Islamic caliphate. Now, what are the main principles of this new religion founded by the Prophet Muhammad? Well, there are 5 what are called pillars of Islam. The first pillar of Islam is a simple declaration of faith, and it goes like this: there is one God, Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That's it. Very simple and direct. If you can believe that, then you can become a Muslim. That was part of the secret, I think, of Islam's appeal, because of that noble simplicity of the declaration of faith. The Christian religion had become enveloped in a lot of arguments and theological controversies over very fine points of theology, and sometimes there had even been a lot of violence over those points. But Islam had a certain simplicity and clarity that many people found attractive. The second, obligatory prayer. If any of you have friends or relatives who are Muslim, or if you are in fact Muslim, then you know that 5 times a day devout Muslims stop whatever they are doing, and they unroll their prayer mats, and they pray to Allah. And when they pray, they are supposed to face towards the city of Mecca, which from North America would be eastward, of course. So this is a daily regimen of prayer. Compulsory giving, what we call charity. Muslim communities are supposed to help the poor and needy in their midst. In fact, this is considered an obligation, one of the pillars of the Islamic religion. Fasting in the month of Ramadan. Many world religions have an element of fasting incorporated in them. The Muslim form sounds somewhat difficult to me. Basically, there's one month in the Muslim calendar, usually falls in the spring. Their calendar is different from the calendar that most Americans are on, so it doesn't always fall in the spring, but usually it's in the spring. It's called Ramadan. And during this entire month, Muslims are not allowed to eat or drink anything, including water, while the sun is up. So from sunrise to sunset, no food, nothing to drink, not even water. But as soon as the sun goes down, Muslims can then eat and drink to their heart's content. So I've been told, if you have the kind of job where where you have flexible hours, sometimes people will rearrange their schedule so that they sleep during the day and work at night. But of course, not everyone has that luxury. So this is a serious sacrifice, this Ramadan fast, for the vast majority of Muslims. Finally, at some point during their lives, every Muslim believer is supposed to make a pilgrimage, that is, a religious journey, to the city of Mecca, where the Muslim religion originated. So every year, millions and millions of pilgrims flock to the city of Mecca. I had a Muslim student once who I asked, what if you can't really afford that? Because that would cost quite a bit of money with airfare and hotels and so forth. What if you really are not wealthy and can't afford that? And she said that there was a loophole, that if you literally could not afford it, then you were excused. But certainly every Muslim is supposed to do their best to try to make it possible to make this pilgrimage to Mecca. If you ever have a chance to read, or if you have read the autobiography of Malcolm X, in that book there's a very touching section where he describes how his journey to Mecca really changed his mind and heart about a number of important issues. So those are the 5 pillars of the Islamic religion, dating to the time of Muhammad and still observed at the present day by devout Muslims. And Muhammad's new religion really began to spread like wildfire. By 636, Islam had taken over the region of Syria, formerly belonging to the Byzantine Empire. By 638, the holy city of Jerusalem itself had fallen to the Muslims, and even to this day, the possession of Jerusalem is split and disputed between Jews and Muslims. Between 639 and 641, the nation of Egypt was conquered by Islam, and between 640 and 644, Iraq too became Muslim. In fact, Islam eventually reached as far away as Spain in the southwest corner of Europe. In the year 711, the old Visigothic kingdom in Spain collapsed and was replaced by Islamic rule. So let me show you on the map here how the Muslims' empire, if you will, had expanded mostly at the expense of the Byzantine Empire. You see how the Byzantine Empire has shrunk now because of the vast increase in lands controlled by Islam. There were a number of reasons for this. You know, sometimes people think that the Muslim armies simply forced everyone that they encountered to convert at sword point, and that really is not true by and large. The residents of these regions had their own motives for converting to Islam. For example, in the Middle East and in North Africa, many Christian believers were considered by the leaders of the Christian Catholic Church to be what are called heretics. A heretic is someone who disagrees with or disputes certain teachings, certain accepted teachings of a religion. For example, many of these people denied the idea of the Trinity, that there's one God in substance, but that he has three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There had always been a lot of Christians who objected to that idea or thought it was nonsensical. And so a lot of those Christians were very favorably disposed towards Islam because, again, the statement of faith of Islam is there is one God, Allah. Islam is very, very strictly monotheistic. And so for those Christians who disbelieved in the Trinity, Islam, for many of them, became a kind of logical choice. Also, in North Africa especially, there had been a lot of violence and mayhem committed by nomadic tribes that were raiding into the settled areas of North Africa, and the Byzantine Empire had showed itself quite unable to deal with this problem. So when the powerful armies of Islam swept into North Africa and promised to protect the people there from these raids by these tribes, many of the people gratefully accepted that option. But not everyone in the Islamic world actually converted to Islam. There were still sizable communities of Christians and Jews who continued to practice their religion in Islamic areas. Excuse me. And for the most part, the caliphs and the other leaders of the Islamic world allowed them to do that, tolerated them as they practiced their own religion. However, there were certain discriminatory laws that were passed against Christians and Jews in the Muslim world. For example, they were supposed to live in special neighborhoods. They had to wear a certain type of clothing to identify themselves as non-Muslims, somewhat like Hitler made the Jews wear a gold Star of David on their clothing to signify that they were Jews in Nazi Germany. They were not allowed to build Christian churches or Jewish synagogues, so they had to worship privately in people's homes. Certain jobs were not open to them. Higher education was not open to them, and they had to pay higher taxes to the government. But for the most part, Christians and Jews were tolerated. They were not forced to convert to Islam, but they did suffer quite a bit of discrimination in the Muslim world. Well, I mentioned that Abu Bakr was the first caliph of the Islamic religion, but and then that title continued in Muhammad's family with Caliph Ali, who was Muhammad's son-in-law. But in the year 661, Caliph Ali was assassinated, and that led to a huge split in the Islamic world, one whose repercussions are being felt down to this day. Because at that point, with Ali dead, members of another family, not Muhammad's family, the Umayyads, took over and became the caliphs. And that was the origin of the split. So basically, there was a group within Islam known as the Shiites who objected to that, who said, no, the caliph has to be a member of the Prophet Muhammad's family. We will not follow any caliph that is not actually related to the Prophet Muhammad. Those were the Shiites. Well, the Sunnis thought that was a load of Shiite. Sorry, that's the only joke in the entire course, so I hope you enjoyed that. The Sunnis accepted the Umayyads as the caliphs. They didn't think it was necessary for the caliph to come from the family of Muhammad. And now, 13 and a half centuries later, Sunnis and Shiites are still fighting it out in the Islamic world. And there's been tremendous violence, tremendous bloodshed, and it's going on today between the forces of Sunni Islam and the forces of Shiite Islam. That certainly has come into play in American foreign policy in recent years. The number one Shiite nation is Iran, which of course is one of the major enemies of the United States in the Middle East. And this split has made itself felt in the attempts to rebuild Iraq as well. That is the origin of the great Sunni-Shiite split, which has caused a lot of havoc in the Islamic world down to the present. In the year 750, yet another family, not related to Muhammad, took over the caliphate. When they did that, they killed all the members of the Umayyad family except for one who managed to get away. He went to Spain and founded his own caliphate there in Spain. But the Abbasids in the Middle East decided to move the capital from Damascus, Syria, to Baghdad in present-day Iraq. And the civilization that they built there was truly splendid. And it was actually far more advanced, at least in terms of wealth and trade and technology and science, than Western Europe was at this time. In fact, it is absolutely true that most of the gold coins in Europe came from the Islamic world through the slave trade, because the Muslims typically enslaved people from Eastern Europe. That is why, to this day, the peoples of that region are known as Slavs. That's actually where we get our word for slave, because Eastern Europeans were commonly kidnapped into slavery in the Islamic world by European slave traders who then collected gold for them from their Islamic masters. Islam was very advanced in terms of trade and commerce. Also, there were institutions of higher learning in the Islamic world known as madrasas, which officially taught two subjects, theology and Islamic law, which is known as Sharia law. There is actually a lot of controversy in the world today over Sharia law. Again, as I record this lecture in 2021, the Taliban has just taken over Afghanistan, and people are asking, will they implement the full-on Sharia law where thieves have their hands chopped off and women caught in adultery are stoned to death. Those are actually provisions of the Sharia law, which have been enforced in some of the more strict Muslim countries in recent years, not in the more mainstream Muslim countries. But it was a highly developed and sophisticated system of law, Sharia law, taught in the madrasas. And in fact, Islamic scholars did a lot better even than the Byzantine scholars, not only in preserving the ancient Greek philosophical books and scientific books, but also in using them to create stunning new scientific technological developments, such as in the field of medicine. You see, Islamic medicine was very advanced. You see a page from an Islamic medical manuscript dating from around the year 1200 there on the left. Muslim scholars translated these ancient texts into Arabic. They used them to develop new insights. And in later years, when Western Europe came into contact with the Islamic world through the Crusades, there began to be an exchange of these texts with scholars in Western Europe. And so Western Europeans owe a great debt of gratitude to Muslim scholars, because if it hadn't been for those Muslim scholars preserving these ancient Greek texts, they could never have been read, they could never have been used to develop philosophy, politics, law, and science in the Middle Ages in Europe.